Hello, welcome everyone to DePINed. I'm Tom Trowbridge, your host. Really excited to have Ryan here from Foam, who's going to give us yet another really exciting and I think very important use case for DePIN, and also I think offer a lot of ways for the community to get involved. And the community, he's going to explain how his community is critical to the project's success. And so very excited to have Ryan with us. With that, I want to kick it off right away. Ryan, we'd like to start with, DePIN is a new term. We've got, different definitions of it. How would you, first of all, define DePIN?
Hey, Tom, happy to be here and great to get started on that question. Not to be too obvious, but, for me, DePIN is of how smart contracts and blockchains can interact with the physical world. And that's kind of been our interest, or my interest with Foam for a long time. And kind of an analogy we thought of a while back is kind of a cross between Google Maps and a Bloomberg terminal, where you have this kind of spatial indicators of value and kind of like 3D marketplaces. So how do we bring this like financialization of DeFi and start connecting that to the physical world, so you can start to see all these different sensors or things picking up value and can maybe kind of visualize that in a spatial way, and kind of get that financial side of it too. So
definitely want to get into what you're doing, and that sounds like you did a little bit. But how, for just the DePIN definition, which I think you access, that is a broad definition. One definition I'm working with is crowdsourced infrastructure bound together in a software layer that is secure and incented by crypto economics and blockchain. Is that broad enough, do you think, or is it too narrow? How do you think about that as just an encompassing definition?
I think that's a pretty great encompassing definition. Definitely crowdsourcing kind of participation from capital expenditure, setting up the supply side is key to DePIN. And then, unlocking marketplaces, connecting that on chain. So I think probably your definitions may be better than mine for all encompassing.
Well, I've been doing this, trying to talk about and explain it. So I've had a head start, but let's get into Foam. You kind of gave a preview of it in your answer, but let's get into exactly what you do and how it works.
Yeah. So Foam is essentially a proof of location as the core of our protocol. And you may ask what that is. And our goal is to be able to bring location data on chain that kind of is trusted and verified in a way that can't be spoofed. So typically when you think of positioning or localization, we're most familiar with GPS. It's on everybody's smartphone and works amazing. GPS is a satellite system, but it's one directional. So the system doesn't know anything about what's happening on the ground. And because of that, it becomes pretty trivial to spoof or lie about your location. We've seen that with Pokemon Go or Uber, and some DePIN projects are facing people spoofing their location. So with proof of location, we have hardware and radios. You can think of it as kind of like a local GPS network that can get set up. We call it a zone. Other than being on the ground, the primary difference from GPS is that it's bidirectional. So a user or machine can countersign cryptographically over radio with these radios that we call zone anchors in the area that they have coverage, called the zone. And with this bidirectional communication and signing, the zone can do kind of like triangulation and determine the location of the user and relay that onto a blockchain. So currently, you can think of that as like an NFT you mint that is your location claim. And the only way you could get it is by interacting with these radios. So kind of meaning you needed to be there. So it's try to prevent spoofing. So that's what we call proof of location.
And so is the Foam network both the devices that are used to triangle location, and then it's made up, that's kind of the core of the network, and then the use of the network is the individuals or people that prove their location or need to prove their location, and so are using that network, using the signals from those devices to prove their location.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a supply side of what we call zones and zone anchors. We typically see them installed on roofs that could get line of sight to each other. And then on the user demand side, we have like a mobile transmitter. So that's either something like a ledger with a radio, or it's something built into a forklift. It can take different shapes or sizes, this mobile node. But yeah, exactly. If you're in an area of coverage and then you want to get this location claim on scene, once you're synced up with your wallet, you can click a button on a radio, see in the app which radios heard you. If enough heard you, they can determine your location. And then if you choose, you could mint that on chain.
And so then the for this network to scale, and we'll ask the question this way. Those devices, is the objective to blanket a certain geography with this, to prove it out in a geography first, or are you going, whether that is a city, a town, a block, or a country, or is it global from the beginning? And kind of how do you think of the rollout, and maybe think about it, because obviously there are similarities with Helium in terms of the amount of hardware deployment you probably want to do.
Yeah, great question. So to give some background, we've been running a beta program. We call it the Trust Zone program. So you have these zones of radios, and in the beta, we obviously trust them because they're working with us to set them up. So for that beta, there was no geographic restrictions. We had one network up in Brooklyn, and our goal with the beta was to test the radios in different environments. So we had people from rural environments to urban environments, and that really helped us kind of test out the radios. But now in terms of like actually moving forward or launching and seeing some of the lessons of other IoT-based projects, on the one hand, the service works scalelessly, meaning if you have one zone, the proof of location service exists where that zone is. So yeah, we're going to be starting with some trying to get some density in some specific areas. So expanding in New York for sign of pilot launches. So there are like multiple zones for potential like game use cases you could hop around, as well as like targeting specific conferences like Consensus in Austin, where we have a zone in coverage, just to kind of build mindshare. But longer term, we don't want to kind of incentivize just coverage for the sake of coverage, and really have the scaling of zones tied to demand or use cases. So you have these kind of initial premier zones where demand can even spatially go to the zone if a project or team wanted to test it. But we have some mechanisms we call signaling, where somebody could stake where they would want this coverage. And it's kind of like a spatial prediction market. So it would boost rewards in a way, but it's from the ground up. And so scaling potentially can go that way, where there's coverage at the port and there's coverage at a warehouse 10 miles away. And as people rely on this service more, they would say, hey, we want coverage, in between these two sites. So hopefully the scaling kind of is cooped or tied together with where demand is, so that we don't see kind of an explosion of coverage and then a contraction if the demand is not there right away.
There's so many different questions and so many ways I want to go into this, but let's pause on that for 1 second and just talk a little bit, backtrack. Ryan, your background, how you got into this, and kind of your journey to get here.
Yeah, so I've kind of been in the blockchain space for most of my career out of college. I have a background in political science and economics. Towards the end of my time, I was working with a professor on kind of spatial relations in the Arab world, kind of coincided with the Arab uprisings. And we took a deep study at it from like an architecture point of view, like what are like the policing and protesting patterns? How did like this town square become the center? What about these new golf courses and condos? How does that affect things? So I got kind of into more of architecture, went a post-grad program to Columbia in their architecture program. This is at the time that maybe Bitcoin was first entering in the news, 2013, 2014. And there was a lot of discussions in the architecture school of how architects could regain agency over like developers and real estate and be able to design creative things. And so started to come across some of Vitalik's early writings in the Bitcoin magazine about decentralized autonomous organizations, and got excited about new ways of funding and what that could mean for architecture. So long story short, our first project was Foam DAO, which was a decentralized architecture office. Never got out of concept, but was very attracted right away from like token funding, equity crowdfunding, and how that could all happen on chain. Long story short, I met my other co-founders. One was very early at Consensus, Christopher, our CTO, and we realized the power of protocols and that Ethereum would be launching. And over time, realized how important the spoofing problem would be. So kind of gradually starting from a software architecture project, moving into hardware and radios over time. That's a bit of my background.
And what, it sounds like your background was kind of custom built for this project. It almost feels like there's other people who, I for example, with Fluence, kind of, I'm in it because I've been in blockchain for a little while, but decentralized computing was not a study of mine. Neither was serverless. But it sounds like you're almost purpose educated to do this type of a project, and I think that's terrific. But that is a unusually specific and appropriate background for what you're doing, right?
Yeah, definitely. In retrospect, maybe looks on purpose, but through my moving from economics and political science into architecture, found some professors that were talking about like spatial software. So that their analogy there was like a golf course. So that's like something that repeats easily around the world. All of a sudden you have similar golf courses in Dubai and China. So I was thinking of like how architects could design spatial software that could be easily like hack the system or be repeated everywhere. So I've been thinking about that domain for a while, and I'm really excited now with DePIN to actually see like blockchain and the physical world start to collide. And so it's a really exciting time.
Fascinating. Well, then getting back to, you sort of, I guess, early on in your study kind of forecasted some of the problems with GPS and with location spoofing. That is a problem you guys obviously solve. Tell us about, that is, how do I phrase it? It's a better solution than Google, right? Because spoofing isn't possible in your network. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the goal of the system. Sure, we might need to battle test it some more, but ultimately, assuming like the zone is operating correctly or honest, a radio would need to be physically near that zone and countersign a message to be included in their logs or be considered as a candidate for being there. Yeah.
And so then can you explain, I guess, the spoofing problem to people and kind of the element that is, right? I can grasp it in games, like in a Pokemon, but maybe go into that in a little bit of detail for people that aren't familiar with just relying on GPS to get from one place to another, right? They use it for mapping software. That's it. But that is just, a fraction of what people use GPS and mapping for.
Yeah, GPS is so valuable to our society and offers so many benefits. When the government looked at backup and alternatives, came to the conclusion GPS does too much. So it would be too hard for a single service to offer everything GPS does, because not just positioning, but GPS offers a synchronized time source. So even down to like ATMs can synchronize off of GPS. So it offers positioning, navigation, and timing. In terms of spoofing, I alluded to a bit earlier, but the system is one directional. So we have these receivers, whether it's like a Garmin device or your iPhone, but the satellites don't know about who's receiving you. And so most people are familiar with GPS when they open Google Maps and they see this blue dot. Sometimes the blue dot might be moving around a bit. That's most likely because your phone can't hear 4 satellites. So the way the localization works in physics is there need to have 4 sources of time, X, Y, Z, and a fourth for time variance. So your phone or your receiver is looking for at least 4 to hear it. And so once your phone gets your location, let's say you want to then use an app. You already mentioned Pokemon Go. However, my iPhone is now telling Pokemon Go where I am according to my GPS. So as a hacker or spoofer, it's a simple kind of man in the middle intersection. So the simplest version is you open the developer mode in your iPhone when you connect it to your MacBook, and then you can just change where you are and put that your blue dot is in any town or country. A higher level is there are apps in the App Store where it changes where your location is. So you could pretend you're on a dating app in a different city or something. And then above that, you could jailbreak your iPhone to spoof further. And then the higher order is like broadcasting fake GPS signals to trick everybody else around you that they're somewhere else. So there would be like a car show in London, some sort of hacker spoofer was broadcasting fake signals, so every car showed it was in Germany on the show floor. So those are different levels of spoofing. But then in terms of like why, other than Pokemon Go, on like the Uber side, if I'm with I have a bunch of friends who are drivers who all work at Uber. If we collude to turn off our phones or change our location and park at the airport, everybody who lands and orders an Uber, it'll show that there are no cars nearby. Surge pricing will get triggered. All of the Uber drivers are actually there. They get this bonus of surge pricing. So Uber has spent billions preventing their drivers from spoofing and cheating the network, but then Lyft has to actually go and try and solve it for their network, or Bird Scooters, or everyone down the line. It's kind of like a Band-Aid issue, and that's why backups or alternatives could, help solve spoofing for not just one specific company.
And so you go to the Uber, for example, in your solution, you need two things to happen. Each car would need to have one of your receivers, and then you would need to have a network sufficiently dense of your line of sight transmit, or your line of sight receivers, I guess you call them, I'm not even sure, in the area the drivers were operating in, right?
Yeah, there's definitely a chicken and egg to be able to service a company as large as Uber, but that's just
location,
Yeah, and just in terms of setting up, we call them zone anchors for the supply side. You need like a good 4 with line of sight to kind of kickstart the network, but the user on the ground doesn't need line of sight to all of them. And then if you start to grow beyond 4, they all don't need line of sight. And we have different localizers in our software stream. So you could get a hit if only like 1 heard you. If like 2 heard you, they could sign. But then once you start to get 3 or 4, then you can start to get precise localizations.
And help me understand the coverage of this. So if you want to cover whatever metric you look at, like is it differ whether it's tall buildings or not? And is it block by block? Is it kilometer by kilometer? Is it city by? How do you think about how many things you need to cover a geography?
I would say not to be redundant, but we think about it as zones. And so it's probably more on a kilometer basis, because it does just change so much on the RF environment. So like Midtown Manhattan is probably a lot different than the Brooklyn Navy Yard where we're based. And like we're testing outside Newark, where we have like a 10 node network, and we see how, because there's like an interstate in between, just like affects things. So in terms of like distance between the nodes, they could be like 4 kilometers apart. But in terms of how many you might need to cover that like 4 square kilometer area is like starts to touch on, like line of sight analysis, like what is the RF environment and things like that. So it doesn't need to be like deep telco planning, but when we were looking at a new potential city or site, we're using some of these line of sight tools and just seeing like, are there big like blockers in the area?
And do you source? You don't put them? Presumably, you rely on the community to purchase and deploy these receiver, or not receivers, these nodes, right?
Yeah. So we, like I've said a bit earlier, we've been running a beta, which resulted in a number of community members participating in building actually these radios. So we previously had like DIY Raspberry Pi based nodes with a custom hat where we have an FPGA that does the timestamping. So for example, the Ethereum San Diego community was in our beta, and they had like a number of build sessions with their community, and then got to install them up on roofs. And in this beta, we've had like from these Ethereum community groups to hobbyists all the way up to like wireless internet service providers that are participating. And so we now have these plug and play radios, which are much more performant and have a custom PCB. And so we're going to have like a renewed call for testnet for those nodes. We're kind of on a road for like an open network. So we're very grateful to the community that's been part of our beta, and we'll have kind of renewed calls for people to get involved for these plug and play ones, which will be able to be purchased, yes.
And help us understand the economics. You think a purchase price would be X, and then will there be rewards for deploying and proving it, and how the rewards decline over time, or how does that how does that economic flow work?
Yeah, I don't want to be held to the cost of the plug and play one because we only manufactured a small run for this pilot, like 100. So the cost maybe will change, but you could just call it 500 per device, and you need 3 or 4 to set up a zone, plus some accessories like antennas or if you need to mount it. The economics are that to be a zone, you need to stake foam tokens into like a service level agreement, like an SLA contract. This will be a smart contract that essentially, almost like a taxi medallion. This is like your right to do work on the network. And staking is that you're, not going to insert false timestamps or have X number of uptime. And we are a fixed supply token, a foam token. So 35% of the supply has been reserved for like these localization mining rewards for these zones. So there will be some sort of a decay of foam token emissions. And then those will also then be affected by what I mentioned earlier, signaling. So if somebody was staking foam on a map that, hey, we wanted radio coverage here, and then that came up, that would impact the emissions. But longer term, the main idea of having this SLA is that you get a right to the fees. So if users are requesting presence claims from your zone, there's an associated fee that the zone can capture. And because different zones may have different overhead, if I wanted to set one up in Palo Alto, I'm sure the building owners would give me some crazy quotes to lease their roofs versus maybe a different state or a different country. So it's possible to kind of have dynamic pricing based off, what are the zone operators' overhead, but there are kind of like token rewards to kickstart things.
And yeah, I mean, the token rewards, I mean, that's why I sort of look at DePIN as, and your project, I think, is an example of this. You tell me if I'm wrong, but where it couldn't have existed, or the capital required to do your project, to roll it out, it would make it very hard, almost unachievable pre-token world, because the tokens effectively allow the market to value where this will be in the future, pull that forward. You get to share that with people that are bootstrapping your network in advance of the actual usage happening, in a way that you would only be able to do that with cash payments prior to crypto. Because if you tried to even do it with equity, you couldn't just give little slivers of equity checks to people because the regulations don't permit it. Is that fair? Like, it's sort of like a lot of DePIN projects, your project couldn't have existed without the crypto economics, both for you, both your technology, right? It's proved on the blockchain. So that's kind of a gating item. But then DePIN, the kind of crypto economics piece, you couldn't roll out without that as well, I'm guessing.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. So because I agree so much, can just add a few from a different point of view about why it's only possible now. So only in the last few years, and definitely Helium leading the pack of showing like what token incentives can do for what people are going to go out and do in the physical world. Seen some crazy installs there. But also this IoT technology, we've heard a lot of promises about it for many of years, but it actually hasn't been on the market for that long. And when you then combine that with the advances we're seeing in cryptography, distributed systems, and blockchain, and then I mentioned as well FPGAs we use for timestamping. They've come down in cost and size a lot too, compared to like 20 years ago. So all of these kind of elements make it for like why and now this is only possible.
Super interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think that's very specific to what you're doing. I want to backtrack to one question. Do operators then have to operate a zone, i.e., for you, and that's you're a zone operator as opposed to just one device? So if I want to participate in your network, or is that still something you're contemplating? Do I need to have basically buy 4 devices and put them up?
You don't need to buy 4 and put them up. So you could be like a lone wolf that could still relay data over IoT onto Ethereum, or countersign people for witnesses, saying that like I witnessed you and countersigned cryptographically. but you can't get like a localization. So just with one node, you could get something like RSS, receive signal strength. So you could estimate like how far away this node might be or which direction it might be. So you do need 3 or 4 to get that full localizations. But as a user, no, I don't need to like own 4. So 4 people could come together, or you have one guy who started, or woman or person, with 4, and then the zone contract would allow like an additional zone anchor to join the zone. So then if they could like talk back, they would be added to the zone.
And how do rewards, or how are you pricing the rewards? Is it you mentioned 35% of supply was reserved for it, but how does that work vis-a-vis the, monthly, daily, whatever payments? How's that reward schedule look?
Yeah, it's not fully implemented yet, but we call it the code name, I guess, TFAR, foam total area reward contract. So if there's some sort of like set epoch, it would look at like how much work a zone had done, like how many, if it was in an area that was boosted by signals, was it down or suspected of cheating, and issue rewards out at that amount. We've been working on what we call our MVP. So this is like the full suite of smart contracts that demo the end-to-end on-chain aspects, including bounties and payments and staking, but not yet the reward schedule. So it's one of the things on our roadmap as we continue to launch these testnets.
But it sounds like the reward schedule is going to be network wide and will be balanced towards the locations or zones that are most kind of viable or suitable or or most attractive. Is that kind of a fair comment? So 2 zones, one in the middle of nowhere, one in New York City. New York City may get more rewards than the other one. Is that roughly? And yet and if there's one zone in the whole network that gets all the rewards, there's a million zones, and their rewards are divided among those in some proportion based on the activity.
Yeah, I think
broad
options there, but yeah, there'll be some baseline like even amount, assuming you're a valid zone, and then kind of multipliers on either amount of activity or amount of people signaling that they want coverage there.
Gotcha. Interesting. Okay. Well, yeah, I see that. And that also presumably helps prevent people from saying, oh, this is a good zone. There's already a zone there. Some other group comes along and wants to deploy duplicative service right there. Because that's obviously, you don't want that to happen.
Yeah. But yeah, I think we done a lot of progress on the actual hardware design, firmware, and now I could mention we're building on the Optimism stack on Ethereum and our initial set of smart contracts and getting these beta zones up. So the kind of refining of emission schedules is definitely on our roadmap to define, but yeah, definitely high level, that sums it up.
Awesome. And then the receiver piece, how much do you think any sense of cost and complexity of those?
It can take different shapes and sizes, but we're working on one that would, maybe be the most appealing to crypto folks to start. Kind of the size of the palm of your hand and pretty thin. We're looking to make them as cheap as possible, like below $50.
Terrific. Great. Super interesting. Well, I mean, thinking about, your work building this, what I think is incredibly, just from the outside, listen, I can only imagine the complexities of dealing with hardware, right? Like Fluence, we just take existing CPUs and we figure out a way to try to monetize those CPUs for people. So we have zero, software complicated. You have software, obviously, but you also got to deal with hardware. So you want to talk about the difficulty there, challenges. There must have been, I'm sure there've been delays. I mean, how do you think about that kind of hardware component of everything?
Yeah, hardware really takes, I guess, a lot of patience and time. In terms of like, one of the biggest disruptions was during COVID, or even after, like lead times for parts. You were getting quotes of like 57 weeks, and it's like, what does that really mean? And so one of the things that definitely I guess, slowed some stuff down is with this plug and play model. At a certain point, we had to completely re-architect the schematics due to like Raspberry Pi compute modules not being available. So we had to like target a different type of board. We're working with a Xilinx one. So just those kinds of like a supply chain we were really faced. And now even after the fact, like I don't think Raspberry Pis are anywhere near as cheap as they used to be. That kind of like resonates. And then, yeah, just needing like kind of bridging the gap between the electrical engineers and the software side and figuring out, bugs and firmware. So there's a lot of troubleshooting involved, but proud of our team of how much work they're putting into it.
Well, and it makes it, it's hard for a reason. It's also, it's why others haven't done it. Any advice you would give to someone else who is doing, a DePIN project or thinking about a DePIN project that involves hardware? Any lessons learned?
Yeah, I think if you're going the route of, just trying to tap into tokenizing, crowdsourcing, people participating in your network and want to, maybe use existing hardware, that's maybe an easier route. But if you want to start making like custom PCBs and boards, I think we had some really amazing outside partners, which were not easy to get, and definitely trial and error of having some bad outside partners. But on the industrial design side and kind of custom PCB side, those outside partners were really crucial, especially during those challenging times.
And how did you find those partners?
One through our where we work in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which is a space called the New Lab, and they were just have hardware projects non-blockchain there, and so we've been working there for 5 years, and we're lucky to tap into. And actually, I think on the PCB side, I don't want to misname them, but I think it's the founder of Privy. Anyway, someone who used to work at Protocol Labs, had a background in hardware and IoT, and we just connected, and they introduced us to this firm in New Zealand, and we've had an amazing relationship with them since. So just through networking, essentially.
Well, that's awesome. It's a good lesson that networking matters. People do it for a reason. That's definitely interesting. Tell us about like how big do you think this? Where's your vision of where you go with Flow? Like, do you see the future of a huge amount where the default becomes proving location, where people don't trust GPS? Do you view? I mean, there's also, we haven't talked about this, but there's also a kind of security element to this, right? Where you've seen GPS be jammed by countries in certain regions, right? So there's real kind of security elements to this also. So how do you think about the sort of where this ultimately goes?
Yeah, I mean, on the traditional side, like market opportunity for positioning is huge, up to trillions of dollars, whether that's asset tracking, location-based services, mobility. But we think foam can unlock niche solutions, and that the future is going to be very proof dependent and very dependent on attestations, especially as now we move into a world where you don't know, is this a real photo? Is this a real video? And so having an attestation or a proof of location when I'm taking a very important photo of a historical event is definitely where I think the future is going. So on the one hand, there's $1 billion to $1 trillion addressable market where that positioning, navigation, and timing touches. But in terms of like where are we going in our future, having strong proofs of identity, proofs of where I've been, and counters to either AI or deepfakes, I think will be really important as well.
That's really interesting, especially I guess given the fake news concept of a cryptographic proof of the location, for example, of a photo, and presumably and the time also, right? Yeah. That is that's something that seems to be more and more important, especially in the whole news cycle. To do that, though, probably requires you guys to be pretty widespread, because who knows where news is going to be happening.
Yeah, definitely. But as like foam as a location standard, we're also looking into like the Ethereum attestation standards. So maybe you didn't sign over radio with a zone, but it's different types of attestations that are made. The Leica camera has started to test some of this out with like a cryptographic attestation made on the camera at the time of the photo being taken. And so, yeah, maybe there are different tiers of, proving or attestations. And then marketplaces will decide, what level of security is, viable for them to approve it.
And what level of expense they want to incur to do it as well, which is obviously a relevant piece of this. In terms of paying for the service, I imagine that happens in the token. Is the token obviously is used to stake, is provide rewards, and then you own the stake or gets revenue from the network. Is that network revenue stablecoin based, or have you determined how that revenue is going to be based? Is that subscription based? Is it individual, attestation based?
Currently, like in our MVP, we're using foam token as the fee. And so there's like a set fee to mint these presence claims. But as I alluded to earlier, zones could have the freedom to have a custom price or accept like stable coins or different. So as we kind of mature and advance, maybe different zones will have custom business models based on who they're servicing and what kind of volume of activity they're getting.
And they have the ability, a zone has an ability to set a price and have its own business model.
That's the kind of vision
that's very different than like a Helium, for example, right?
Well, yeah, as I was trying to kind of think through earlier is, you have these zone overhead costs of like, I might have to rent this roof space and, one city, it might be really expensive. So I'm like, man, I got to make my money back. I'm going to cost $10 to mint a presence claim here. And then maybe in like a rural area where there's like a supply depot and they are really happy to have the service. So there's no cost to the zone operator. And then they could, maybe set it for 10 cents. And they're getting a really high volume because this is some like truck depot. And so maybe they're better off than the one that had a higher fee in a different state.
But that's really interesting. That leads to that shows how the ability for zones to set their own pricing is a real decentralization. There's real evidence, I guess, of decentralization, right? It basically you're talking about, a component of almost franchises in a way, right? That are working, I guess, on common standard hardware, may not be the same hardware, but that are free to set their own prices based on where they're and what they think the market will bear and what their expenses are, right?
Yeah, that's the long-term vision, that you have this like baseline protocol that everyone has to follow these baseline rules of like, we're not faking the system or I could be punished for X. We have to think through adversity of, somebody who's like, presence claims are now free. And then how do you really trust them? So maybe there's some middle ground we need to work through. But yeah, the idea is we don't want to incentivize coverage for the sake of just coverage and have zones that could be used, and maybe different ones will specialize for different users. And so then if that's the case, to have their own business model or fee model or even embedded mobile transmitter, flexibility would definitely be the goal.
Super interesting. Is the governance going to be decentralized as well? What is governance of the project and protocol going to be? We need to kind of think through that a bit more, I would say, as we've been testing this beta and MVP and rewards. But yeah, there's meant to be governance through zones. We've had different ideas in the past of like a zone authority, because maybe it has like the best internet connection or something to that effect. Or so maybe within a zone, there's even governance of between the zone anchors and how they split rewards. So it's governance all the way down, most likely. Excellent. Well, and how do you think, let's zoom out for a second, DePIN overall? I mean, you obviously see your project as having, very significant scale potential. I imagine you don't think your project is the only DePIN project with scale potential. So how do you think DePIN overall, kind of the prospects for this, broadly defined sector, are over the coming, decade or so?
I think tremendous, because I think it'll eventually converge. I'll take a step back. I just came back from a great conference at the University of Maryland on open geospatial systems and decentralization. And I was thinking back to when I started Foam, and I was like, well, I really would have loved if this conference was back when I was talking to all these mapping people. They were like, what's blockchain? So I think that ultimately this will kind of converge with the traditional like IoT space. And so DePIN will keep growing. And as they kind of go to more conferences or what have you, I think more business deals will be done. And I think we'll see a convergence with like the traditional Web2 IoT space. And so like a project like Demo definitely has a really big head start with the growing community. I think WeatherXM is pretty interested to have like hyper local weather. But as those systems, scale, I already see partnerships with like manufacturers in China that make Web2 type IoT things. So I think we've already tried to see those converge. And so that scale will be able to be reached by a lot of different projects as we kind of blur the lines between Web2 and blockchain projects.
I mean, I see that line blurring for sure. But alluding to something you kind of mentioned early on, the line blurs, but DePIN without paying CapEx, right? It's such an advantage over traditional companies who need to install the network, have this cost basis. And so I see it's hard for me to envision. There's certain sectors where it's hard for me to see how DePIN projects, protocols do not become kind of the dominant providers in not every sector, obviously, but certainly in some.
I would hope to see that kind of the ultimate goal of our industry is disintermediation. And definitely in these physical services, we could use a lot of that.
And so you mentioned the project, the other question I would like to ask is what projects you like. You mentioned a couple just then. You mentioned, Demo. Do you want to just give us a second on one or two projects you think are super interesting?
Sure. Yeah. So I think Demo is extremely interesting. Just on like most people don't know how much data their car generates. And so being able to just tap into that and like kind of it's educational for people. So I need to get a car to participate, but just from afar, seeing all that happen. And yeah, I think that HiveMapper also is doing a lot of like how quickly they were able to like incentivize people to drive different roads and things like that. So there's a lot in the car space. And there's another one that we work with actually is Andrina Wireless, and they've been thinking about how they can bring their WISP business model to incentivize more people to run their types of hardware for fixed wireless or things like that. So I think we're just starting to move into even more kind of real world use cases.
Listen, totally agreed. Except you got the wrong answer. The right answer is Fluence. That's what you're really excited about. That is the cloudless computing, but that is it's a slightly adjacent to the things you're obviously focused on. Very hardware specific, hardware oriented, projects, which are I think are really interesting and have big communities behind them. So I certainly see that.
My head was at for antennas, but definitely really excited about what Fluence is doing and seeing how the Filecoin ecosystem is evolving. And that's actually, a really core use case as well for proof of location is trying to enforce like the decentralization of either node operators or where files are stored. So we're working on some POCs on that as well.
Excellent. And then, another question, have to ask this, even though it's not anything, it's outside your expertise, but you're in the crypto and blockchain world. Bitcoin estimate for the end of the year.
I'm not that good at those kinds of predictions, but I'll just go for it for fun. I would say over $100,000. I would hope.
Yeah,
just I got the paradigm shift with the ETF, but yeah.
Yeah, and there's a Hong Kong one coming, and England, and everything else. I think we're well above that. I think that's a safe answer for sure. But definitely agreed with it. Terrific. Well, listen, really appreciate having you on. How can people follow you? Follow everything you're doing.
The quickest way to get follow us at least is follow us at Foam Space on Twitter. And my name on Twitter is Froth City. But we're also been starting to activate Warpcast. So there's a Foam channel there and a chat group. So you could find us easily there and ask some questions as well.
Excellent. Listen, thank you very much for joining. It's been great to learn about Foam. It sounds like it's a important project and one that has huge scale potential. So thrilled the hard work you're putting in to get this hardware operational and rolled out. And we're going to hopefully be seeing it broadly deployed over the coming years. So I'm very excited and thrilled to have you on. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks all for listening.